and welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Winning Content Marketing Webinar Series Strategy. On behalf of Adobe and the American Marketing Association, we'd like to welcome you today. And now I'd like to introduce and also hand it over to our moderator for today, Anthony Salas, the Sponsorship Webcast Manager with the American Marketing Association. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, Alna. Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. We're very excited that you're all here. And at this point, I'm really excited to introduce our presenter for today. Mike Agron is a good friend of mine, a good friend of Adobe and the AMA. He's a web demand generation expert, author, co-founder, and executive webinar producer for WebAttract. And after 25 years in high tech with such firms as Apple, Oracle, and MapInfo, he's learned how to help brands and media publications reach new markets and audiences, especially those that want to promote their thought leadership and attract fresh new sales leads. Mike's company, WebAttract, is a professional service and training organization that helps B2B sales and marketing professionals associated with global and emerging brands as well as media publishers excel at using webinars across the entire life cycle. He and his team are very passionate about helping their clients meet and exceed their commercial outcomes, and while doing all of that, they delight their audiences. So again, Mike's really a great resource and expert in all of this information, and at this point I'm excited to turn it over to Mike to get started.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Alna, for having me, and everybody in the audience from wherever you are. It's we're thrilled to have you. And speaking of passion, that is actually my license plate on the right, and I am a 100% certified webinar geek. I love webinars, and that's really what we do. And I'm starting my 8th year of doing this professionally, and it's just getting better and better and becoming much more fun and much more effective. And what I love about webinars is that they're very theatrical in nature. I mean, think of a webinar like we're doing now. It's a radio show, but with pictures. And what I'm going to be focusing on today are for those of you that are content marketing professionals or demand gen professionals that have responsibility for demand generation. And just to define that, you're either interested in raising the awareness of your organization or your product, you're looking to promote the value of your offerings in your company through your thought leadership, or you're looking to drive sales, or all three of them, which are perfectly all part of the demand generation cycle. And in looking at that, before we get into talking about webinar series and what I'm going to cover, I think it's really important today because the world has changed a lot with how webinars are delivered and what to expect on the effectiveness. I have 6 criteria that I use for measuring webinar effectiveness, and really this is how webinars impact the bottom line. The first one is kind of a no-brainer, net new deals. Everybody loves to close business from a webinar, but as you'll hear, that's not always going to happen. Not all attendees are sales ready to buy now, but there's other great ways that a webinar or a series can help you move the needle, can help you convert prospects who might be on the fence to become your customers and advocates. It can help you upsell and cross-sell to your existing base. It's a very powerful way to increase your sales pipeline, and it also puts you on the map as a viable player. The beauty of not having to worry about renting a physical location allows you to punch up your weight, and you can be the smallest organization and look just as powerful as the largest brand. And along with that, it'll let you reach new markets and geographies. So when you hear some of the case studies I'm going over, all of these have applied to each of them. But today, what we're going to be covering is the why and how. And the 4 things are the benefits of a series over a one-off. I want to talk to you why a series has more value than a one-off. We're going to talk about some case study outcomes. And then I want to go into some of the best practices and lessons learned from each of these examples, and then give you some tips on pulling it together. And the 3 companies that I'm going to be focusing on are from very, very different sectors. The first one is a company called vAuto, which is part of Autotrader.com. The next one is a company called Novel, which is part of the Reed Elsevier Group. And the final is Bosch healthcare. So I looked at the folks, those of you in the audience, and I know you cut across all different organizations, but the thing to keep in mind is regardless of your industry, all of these have lessons learned and value that you can apply to what you're doing. But to get started, I want to learn more about you, and I want to ask Alna if you'll launch the first poll. And what I want to know is, how do you use demand generation webinars? And let me know, are you doing one-off webinars? Do you have a content marketing webinar series program? Are you considering doing a content marketing series? Do you do both? Or you've neither done one or the other? And then let's share the results. And let's take a look. About 20% of you are doing one-off webinars. Small percentage, about 8%, have a content marketing series program. That's encouraging. 23% of you are considering doing a content marketing series. About 16% do both, and about a third of you haven't done any. So that's good to hear, because there's something in this webinar for everybody. So I always have to start by setting the stage, because as I said, webinars are theatrical. And in setting the stage, I did some thinking at the end of last year. What really did I learn from working with all of these different clients? And I must tell you that one of the exciting things about working with a lot of different industries is that I have a front row seat to learn a lot of cool stuff, regardless of the market they're in. But there were 5 key lessons that really came home to roost. And each one of these is going to play a role in each one of these case studies. So it is kind of setting the stage. All of them follow this. The first one, really is a basic one, is the relevance of your topic, of your webinar. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the problems you're trying to solve? Is it like that gentleman in the bottom left of the screen who's got a lot of questions? He's looking for better outcomes, or he's got pain points. Or is it like the lady on the right, where she's actively looking for a solution? These are the types of people that would be interested in your webinar. But the most important thing is it a must-have or a nice-to-have? If it's not a nice-to-have, you're probably not going to get anybody or very few people to sign up. It's got to address these points. And part of the way that's done is going along with shifting our thinking from the traditional marketing approach to content marketing. Content marketing is informational. It's case study driven. It's best practices. It's lessons learned. It talks about business value or metrics, return on investment, rather than a sales pitch. It doesn't talk about the product. It may mention it, but it doesn't talk about it. It doesn't talk about features or benefits. It doesn't talk about pricing. What it really does is it educates and makes buyers much more intelligent, with the objective of, when you have a conversation, making it more profitable for both of you. And speaking of content, there's so much great content around. Where do you find it? It's available in white papers that you have, case studies from your clients, your partners, publishers and editors and authors have great content, industry analysts. All of these things are begging to have life into them from telling a great story. And that's exactly the part about webinars. It's a time for storytelling. I love this picture because it reminds me of when I was much younger, and I would either go with my parents and we would go camping, or when we took our kids camping. The fun part was always sitting around and telling a story. And that's what a webinar allows you to do. It lets you breathe life into content that ordinarily is static, like a research report or a white paper, and add something to it. And the way you can tell a story, and some of the most popular B2B thought leadership webinar themes are the 3, and you're going to hear about them. The first is a case study where you talk about business improvement. The example here is how Parker Aerospace took advantage of existing workstations to do more simulation, and it was presented by HP and Intel. So it came from a third party. The next is a how-to or tutorial. How do you do something? This was about letting companies that aren't normally thinking of using composites like aerospace for using them in legacy materials. So we wanted to educate them on that. And the third, and one of the most powerful, is on standards and compliance. And you'll see why in a second. Changes is something that people want to stay on top of. How is new legislation or new standards going to impact your business? And that really goes to what I have found as another lesson learned. More than anything, it's why you must embrace disruption. And the reason is simple. Confusion plus change drives opportunity. Think about it. The more confusion, the more change, the more people want answers. This is an opportunity to do that and to be able to take advantage of markets that are in disruption, that are going through industry shifts, because now you can tell a story beyond sound bites. You can highlight innovative solutions. You can promote your thought leadership. All of these are afforded you by disruption. And really, the best way to do that is to use thought leaders. Now, these thought leaders can be internal or they can be external. And I'll show you that it's always my advice to have at least one external thought leader because they add credibility. And, a thought leader is someone who is recognized as an expert in the particular space that you're interested in, and they seek your help. And if you think about it, if you become that person, that go-to person, like the fish on the farther side, they're going to want to learn from you, and they're going to trust you, and they're going to want to know how you can help them. Thought leaders are an extremely important component of a webinar. The email invitation subject line. 90%, 95% of the heavy lifting today in promoting webinars is still done through email marketing. Yes, social media helps, and there's other ways. And I kind of put this as tongue-in-cheek. The webinar invitation, if it's not opened, no one's going to register for your webinar. So the subject line is absolutely critical. I wish I had a simple formula to tell you how to do that. I'm going to give you some examples in some of these case studies. But really, when you're sending out that invitation, what you're really saying is, hey, I have a cool webinar. Please open up my email and register. But again, if it's not a must-have, it doesn't capture their imagination and show them how it's going to add value, they won't open it. Finally,
hey, Mike,
one of the most important things. Yeah, go ahead there, Anthony.
Sorry about that, Mike, but I just I got to just chime in for a quick second on that subject line issue there. As you said, I we both deal with this all the time, but just to kind of back up what you said, I think that's a huge one right there. The subject line is where you're really going to capture the attention there. And we could probably do another webinar just on subject lines because I think it's that big of an issue. I don't know about you, but I think, just to throw out a best practice that I've experienced is shorter is better. Get your point out there, get it out there fast. If you can use some numbers, 5 tips that you're going to get, 3 items you're going to learn, that kind of thing, always work really well. And I know you're going to show some examples of that. So definitely looking forward to seeing what your thoughts are on that. But I just wanted to chime in real quickly there.
No, I'm glad you did. You're absolutely right. We could do a webinar series on subject lines. And I would tell you that this is one of the most important areas to have a strategy around, to really think them through the whole series. But the point is, you need to have a subject line that grabs attention. The fifth thing, and this really pulls it all together for last year, this year, and either whether you're doing a one-off webinar or you're going to do a series, you've got to remember your buyers are on a journey. Don't sell. 70% of your buyers are looking for some level of information before they make a determination that they want to speak to you. That's what's critical. And it's just like the people on the left they're curious. I put that little retail store there on the right because I think this is so representative of what we've all experienced. I know I have. I'm interested in something. We're all interested in something, and all right, we're going to go to this retail store. We're not sure what we want, but we're looking around, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, somebody jumps in front of us, this very enthusiastic person, and says, "Hi, may I help you?" And you stop and look at them and go, "No, thanks, I'm just looking." You really don't know what it is you want. When you want help, you'll ask them. It's the same thing with the webinar. The best thing the webinar can do is to present how you can help people. If they're interested, they'll follow up with you. And that 70% number is so important to remember, because that's a high bar to cross over. But your challenge is to really create an engaging event. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's to get people to want to have a one-on-one conversation with you after the webinar to then become your customer. That's when the real selling starts. But part of the beauty of doing a webinar that you don't necessarily get with a live in-person event is you can gather lifecycle intelligence and metrics across that lifecycle. Anthony mentioned that we manage the entire life cycle. There's great information you can get before the event on learning who the people are, their interest, during the webinar using polls and questions and surveys, and after the event, the same thing with surveys and finding out what type of viewing you have on the on-demand, just terrific ways. But I talk about metrics in here, and I see that they're not on the slide here, but I will tell you what's supposed to be on there. There's 6 key webinar metrics before, during, and after. The first one is what's called the click-through ratio, and that's how many people come to your landing page and actually register. I'll give you some examples of that. Then there's the attendee ratio. Both of these are predictors on how well your subject line is doing and your messaging for what kind of people will attend your webinar. Then there's the use of online polls to let people weigh in and see the engagement. There's exit surveys to find out how today's webinar met their expectations. Audience retention is absolutely critical. How long were you able to keep people engaged? I'd say that a rule of thumb is we want to see 80% of the peak audience still on at the time of the start of the Ask the Experts. And then there's on-demand viewings. All of these are important metrics that you use before, during, and after. And the real question here is, did the webinar move the needle on the intent to purchase? What we have is a example where with some of our clients, we will do a post-webinar survey and ask them, after viewing today's webinar, did it change your plans to purchase? Now, it's okay to do that after the webinar because you've already given information. You don't want to do it at the front. And in this particular example, 47% said, based on the information they learned, that it increased their interest in purchasing. 24% said they were just researching, but they intend to acquire. About 24% also said they were researching, there's no need. 5% said it decreased. So think about that intelligence that you get when you get this information and you mine it and you look at it for who's more sales ready, who needs nurturing. It's a very, very powerful way to establish a warm conversation after the webinar. So let's go on the journey. Let's start this journey together. And the first company is a company called vAuto. And they're a subsidiary of autotrader.com, which you probably are familiar with. This is one of the most interesting requests for a webinar I had. And I'm going to talk to you about how the leading provider of automotive retail advanced software tools was able to balance a need for customer retention versus attracting new customers. And here's why it was an interesting call. What they do is they provide a very, very interesting technology that provides live information. That's why it's called Live Market View. And it allows dealers to not have to worry about guessing on pricing for cars. They don't have to worry about managing a lot of different incentives. And they're basically able to sell more cars without the battle because it gives them information in real time at their fingertips on what's happening in the car sale space. And as you can see, their tagline is, it's time for a new way to sell more new cars, make more profit, and leave your old car thinking behind. Perfect example of disruption. Perfect example of an industry shift. Buying a car today is not like it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. The cards no longer are held close to the vest by the salesperson at the car dealership. As consumers, we have a lot more information, and they know that, and they have a tool to help organizations and dealerships increase their profits. So their challenges and desired incomes were the first, that there needed to be a way to retain dealers that were under contract. And here's where it became interesting. Just about a year ago, they went to market with this solution, and they ended up selling hundreds of them, but they found that there was a lag between their ability to implement it and having all these people buy their solutions and pay for it. So their challenge was, how can we use a webinar to educate? When they called me, they said, what can we do? We've got all these people. Is there a way that we can do something to keep them satisfied? So it was about using a webinar to educate. And I'll show you what the series was. But they also had the other challenge of they wanted to create early success stories for new customer acquisition. So they had this challenge of keeping the customer satisfied, and at the same time creating success stories and case studies so they could use this to sell more of their solutions. So we created this series, and it was based on getting thought leaders, and the first one was a tutorial, and it was about a pricing and process blueprint for new car success. And we had a very well-known speaker, his name is Mark Rikas, who came in and talked to the dealers on how they needed to think about new pricing and process. Then we came up with the second one, and that was, okay, something on merchandising strategies. So how do you come up with merchant strategies to conduct new cars or to connect new cars with customers? So one led off the other. And actually, Anthony, these were actually, I think you had asked me during the rehearsal, did we have dates on these? Yeah, we actually did. When we promoted one, we said the next one will be, and we gave the date of it. And then both of these worked so well, and they caught up with their backlog. They said, okay, now we need to open it up and really invite more people to the webinar. So the third one was a case study. And the case study was actually done by one of the early adopters of the technology or of the solution to talk about his success. And I'll show you what we went through. So it was a case study called How Performance Toyota Increased New Vehicle Gross Profit and Sales, something near and dear to the heart of all dealers. And let's take a look at the invitation, not each line item here, but the subject line that we used was New Vehicle Dealer Webinar. ONA, learn how pricing and process helped Performance Toyota increase gross profit and sales. We did a series of drips, and we always do a series of drips. And what I mean by that is it's not just one email blast. It's a set series of them that starts 3 weeks before you go live. What's interesting here is that this subject line garnered a 17% open rate. And for those of you that are familiar with open rates, 8%, 9% is considered good. 12% is outstanding. 17% is exceptional. So this title resonated with the audience. It was relevant, and they opened it. The first thing that we did after the setting the stage was having Dale Pollack, who was the founder and visionary, come on and talk about some of the pricing challenges that car dealerships have with new vehicles. 31% declining gross. It's important that we're now looking at market-based pricing. Consumers respond to fair market pricing, and you absolutely need to get over having to be concerned about minimizing discounts. There's less need to negotiate deals with buyers. All of this is a new way of thinking and doing business. Again, disruption is your friend. They have an innovative solution that can help car dealers be more profitable. The real interesting story was when Jim Blickel came on and shared his case study. He was the dealer principal at this particular dealership. He talked about his challenges of homegrown pricing, using what he called was Jim's suggested retail price. It was very time consuming. He had to do a lot of work on spreadsheets. And then he talked about what his benefits were, what the outcomes were. He had new vehicle pricing improvements. He had better pricing clarity. He increased pricing efficiency. He improved the grosses of $300 a car, which is huge, and greater customer satisfaction. So what was the result of that? Over 895 people registered, 459 attended. That was a 51% attendance ratio, which is excellent. 30 to 40% is good. Average time they were in session was 54 minutes. 93% got tremendous value out of it. What did we learn? By educating their customers and giving them value, they'll become your advocates. The other thing was, again, delivering what the webinar invitation promised. If you promise you're going to deliver these 3 things, you do it. And they utilized well-known thought leaders to set the vision. And the case study had demonstrable outcomes, which added credibility. And the goodwill created advocates and new sales opportunities. And I just spoke to them the other day. This was done last December. They're very excited about the new leads that they have in their pipeline. Now let's shift over to another case study. This is a company called Novel, and they're owned by Reed Elsevier. And they're probably the best example I have of how webinars have been used to promote their thought leadership. They're a web-based analytics firm, and they cater to engineers. And I'm going to talk about how they use these webinars to augment their demand generation efforts. Engineers, and for those of you on the in the webinar that are engineers that work with engineers know that they have a lot of responsibility. They've got to stay on top of best practices. They've got to deal with safety and compliance issues. They need to understand materials properties, and they want to find reliable answers fast. And that's what Novel does. It provides a resource, online resource for engineers to get information that they can trust. But in order to get their interest, what we wanted to do was to realize that the challenges that Novel had was to rise above the noise, and they needed to create visibility. They needed to create trust in their niche markets, and they had to feed the demand gen funnel. So those were the three challenges. Their objectives, they wanted to show thought leadership in the 5 key markets they serve. And they wanted to do that by educating. And they wanted to achieve an average of 250 qualified registrants per webinar. And the call to action post-webinar was to be able to refer audiences to online references, tools, and solutions to educate them and then have them want to learn more. So the series highlights, we started doing this back in 2010 and have delivered about 18 webinars through last year. And if you look at the titles, or if you look at the types, 8 of them were on compliance and standards. 3 of them were tutorials and case studies, and actually 7 of them were on professional development. How can engineers improve their standing and their career? These all together were very successful in drawing a lot of people. I believe we've registered about, as you can see, 6,951 with a high attendee ratio of 41%. Their average time in session was 54 minutes. Their average satisfaction was 91%. But here's what really got really interesting. Because of the value of the topics, that they were able to get a on-demand viewing, which is what the webinar provides as a way to extend the shelf life of the asset. I call it the content marketing gift that keeps giving, where 34% of those 6,951 who registered live went to watch it on demand. But of those people that watched it, 1,572 or 67% of the people that registered were fresh new sales leads. Think about that for a second. It was such a powerful educational forum that people heard about it and wanted to look at it.
Hey, Mike, I'm going to jump in on a quick question here. One of the things that's kind of standing out there is that on-demand viewing number. Do you know if they, or how exactly they promoted that on-demand viewing to reach such a big playback number there?
Yes, a couple things. One way, several ways, Anthony. One way is immediately following a webinar. It's always a good practice to send a thank you email to all the attendees and the no-shows, and let them know that there is an on-demand viewing available. But they also use social media channels. They put it on their blog. They put it on their website. They put it in their newsletter. And there was also buzz. So they did all the right things. They took a great topic and pushed it out there. Does that give you kind of an idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So what were some of the lessons learned? Very similar to everything that you're going to hear from me about today and what I talked about with Viato. Again, rather than use internal experts, which are okay, they used external thought leaders to educate and inform engineers. They brought people in who understood how changes in compliance and standards would impact their business. And they didn't overly promote their own offerings. And in fact, other than maybe a 2-minute welcome from a representative from Novel while we're doing the webinar, that was it. There was really no talk through the webinar about their offerings. Now, in some cases, some of the thought leaders will talk about how you used equations to get better products. But again, they focused the content on the must-have versus the nice-to-have. Compliance and standards. How is the new ISA standard going to impact your business, especially when the consequences are loss of life and limb to personnel, heavy fines, and it could shut you down. That keeps people up at night, so they were looking for answers. And again, they leveraged these industry disruptions to attract and engage an audience. They use things that would be timely to these engineers. And rotated the theme from tutorials, compliance, and professional development. So it was a mix of all of these. Now, the last example I'm going to give you before we get into the Q&A is a company that probably most of you are familiar with in one form or another. It's Bosch, and this is Bosch Healthcare. Their challenge was to attract and educate a diverse group of health-based decision makers on new reimbursement options for telehealth services to drive product sales. Now let's think about it for a second. What industry has been more disrupted than health? Whether you call it the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, that whole industry is upside down and reeling with changes and doing things in a new and different way. So here was what their challenge was. First, let me describe what remote patient monitoring or telehealth is all about. And I know we've got a lot of folks in the audience from healthcare, and bear with me as I do my best to explain it. But remote patient monitoring or telehealth is really about devices to remotely collect and send data to a provider's office, which means you don't have to make an office visit. All right, that sounds interesting. But what's the real payoff with telehealth? Well, the real payoff with telehealth and the way they're doing it is you can get reimbursed for it. And so what their challenge was, how do we go to market and target multiple decision makers from ACOs, which are accountable care organizations, health plans, hospitals, insurance companies, and how can we communicate how telehealth, which is disruptive, it's new, it's different, supports what's called the triple aim. And the triple aim is providing better health to the population, better care, better experience of care, and lower cost per capita. This is really what they wanted to explain. How does it do that? And they wanted to educate the audience on the new value of these S codes. And so those S codes were something that their thought leadership developed, and they were a way to get reimbursed. And so rather than try to sell the product, they sold the benefit of telehealth and gave insights on how these S codes could help them. And so what their objectives were to explain the technology beyond sound bites. It had to go beyond it. They wanted to tell a story. And they wanted to demonstrate how the ACOs, or the accountable care organizations, can use these new telehealth S codes to increase their revenue. Who isn't interested in increasing revenue? And they wanted to test the efficiency of a webinar series. When we started with them, it was for 4. We're now going on our 7th and more in the wings, and I'll show you what they were. So we created what was called a telehealth series, leadership series, and the subtitle was Empowering You. It was about how you can use telehealth to become more efficient in your business. Everything from S codes, how to use telehealth for people who have serious mental problems, how to become more efficient as an ACO with telehealth, on mobility, and then on the one, where are the trends and where are things going? So it was a whole thought leadership series that was done to educate their audience. And what was particularly interesting is the most recent one we did, which was just last month in December. It was called Empowering You, the Future of Technology-Enabled Care to Transform Population Health Management. Again, nothing in here about their product, Telehealth Buddy. But here was the subject line, Telehealth Market Webinar. Experts Tim Rowan and Roeen Rashan discuss how key healthcare technology trends will transform population health management. We had a 37% average click-through ratio, and I mentioned that metric before. This is the gold standard. What does this mean? This means that of the people that came to the registration landing page, of 137 registered for the webinar. That's huge. I think I mentioned this earlier, but 20% is good today. 25% is outstanding. It tells you that your message is resonating. And why I say it's the gold standard is because it's a predictor of the type of attendance you're going to have and the level of interest and relevance that your message has. This is probably one of the most important things, and I can predict to a science what type of registration and attendance through the click-through ratios. But what's interesting is that the series continued to evolve. It started with how advanced remote patient monitoring through new coding options can help you get better outcomes and drive more revenue. And that really talked about the standards and compliance around the Affordable Care Act and around these new S codes. Very, very well attended. And then the most recent one we did was, again, part of the Thought Leadership series, The Future of Technology-Enabled Care. So this is the way it evolved, and there's more coming that's going to continue off this theme. And we have a loyal following, and the people are very interested in this, and they become more interested. They become advocates, and then they eventually become customers. So what was the lesson learned? As I said before, again, we embraced industry disruption to take advantage of the confusion and change and share how people could overcome it. We educated a diverse audience of decision makers and physicians. We provided them a roadmap for successfully coding telehealth services. And again, Bosch did a fantastic job of recruiting industry experts, very well-known people who are on all webinars. In some cases, there was an internal Bosch person, but by all, each webinar had an industry expert on it. What were the outcomes? The outcomes were that for the series, we've had about 2,300 people register. We've had a high attendance ratio. The satisfaction has been 90% or more. It's helped them with their thought leadership. It's increased the sales pipeline. But here is my favorite. And this is a quote from an email they sent me. They said, because of the Thought Leadership series, it's now become a cornerstone of their modern content marketing at Robert Bosch Healthcare. What else can I say? I mean, it's working for them. They're getting the value, and they're getting the following that they're looking for. So these are just a couple of things to look at. So what are the key takeaways? Well, from a strategic standpoint, it really goes through everything that I started out with. Make sure that whether you're doing a one-off or you're doing a series, there's relevance in it for your audience. It's got to be a must-have topic, or don't waste your time doing a webinar. They're just not going to come. Looking how you can creatively embrace disruption and change. That's a very powerful driver. Each one of these examples, Viato used disruption and change with their innovative solution to help dealers make more money. Novel used disruption and change to help engineers learn more about standards and compliance. Bosch Healthcare used disruption and change to help the medical community and the accountable care organizations take advantage of a lot of the confusion going on to be able to provide better outcomes. And all of them had passionate third-party thought leaders as experts. They were really excited to share their information, and they wanted to do a good job, and they wanted to connect with the audience. And as I said, the email invitation subject line is binary. And what I mean by that is your email is either opened or it's not. If it's opened, you got a shot for them to read it and click on a link and register. But if they don't even open it, they'll never register. That's such an important part of today's promotion of webinars. And your attendees are on a journey. Don't sell. Resist the temptation to sell. The time to sell is after the webinar. If they're interested, they'll come to you. Don't sell on the webinar. And as important as anything, all of these companies had a call to action of what they were going to do before, during, and after the webinar to either follow up or do lead nurturing. Because even though you get all of these people who attended, you need to understand, based upon the life cycle intelligence, are they sales ready? Do they need more nurturing? Are they not interested? Make a point of doing that. So I want to go now and just summarize on some of the benefits, why you want to create a content marketing series strategy over a one-off. The first one is it allows you to have multiple impressions. You're able over a period of time to consistently go out to your audience, to a very targeted demographic, and let them know who you are. It helps you become their trusted advisor by giving solid information. It helps you through that create advocates who want to learn more. And when you do that, you're able to help ensure that you achieve your commercial goals for doing the webinar, as well as adding value to your audience. And really, it's content marketing at its best. There's nothing in my experience that does more than a webinar done right, and is probably why they rank as one of the top tactics through the annual B2B study that the Content Marketing Institute does. Done right, when they're effective, they're very, very powerful.
So Mike, amazing stuff here. Yep, sorry about that. I was going to check in with you really quickly and say I think one of the big things that I'm taking from this so far is that thought leadership is really key here. You've got to approach it from that perspective first and foremost, and as you said, really kind of keep the selling part of things totally off the table if at all possible, or really kind of plan that in the best possible way. The only other thing I will say is on a personal note is definitely connect with Mike on LinkedIn if you haven't already with WebAttract. I know I'm on there with him, and you post a lot of good information on there for webcast producers such as myself and many others that I'm sure are on the webinar today. So definitely look at that. But yeah, Mike, we've got a lot of great questions lined up here. A good amount of time remaining. So now I'm gonna start throwing some questions at you here. A lot of individuals are, I think, and we saw this probably on our first poll where, we do have some participants today that are kind of just starting to get all of this going. So kind of an all-encompassing one that came through here, and this one came in from Megan, is, what is the best way to really start building this webinar series strategy? Any thoughts on, maybe some points that people can really hit to really kind of get the ball rolling?
Yes. One of the things that I recommend you do, we do it, it's called the pre-discovery, to scope out what are the business drivers. What is your message? What is your value proposition? What is it you're trying to say? What is the problem you're solving? And who do you want to solve that for? So get your head around that, and then begin to identify who is the audience. Do you want to go deep and wide? Do you want to go very specific? But who is your audience? What kind of industries? What job functions? What titles? What revenue thresholds? How many employees? What geographies? And then understand what success looks like to you. What are the desired outcomes? As I went through my talk, I talked about how some of the organizations we wanted to make sure, what is your call to action? What are your outcomes? And your outcomes could be X amount of people registering, X amount of people attending. After the webinar, you get into so many sales conversations, you have so many demos if that's what you're doing. Is to really think about the arc of what it is you're trying to do, and then who is going to do it with you? Who are you going to find to help be your thought leader? How are you going to get that out there? And if you do that and you find that you have enough information, then I would go ahead and put my toe in the water and do a one-off, or if you're really brave, commit to doing a series, but try it and see what you learn. And because you can find out from your audience what other topics they're interested in. I would say that's the best way to start, is to get that going. And the thing I was going to say is, if you use a white paper or a research report, the good news is that a 5-page white paper is probably 5 webinars. There's so much content in there, and you can't get it all out in one session. So that's how I would start. Pick your best and then go from there. Does that provide the answer? Hopefully, Megan, that provides the answer. And Anthony, let me know if I left anything off.
No, and actually you kind of led into the next question I've got lined up for you here. This one's from Brent. In regards to the number, kind of the optimal number or the frequency of the number of webinars in the series. So, you just said, you got possibly 5 white papers so that each one could probably be its own webinar. But is there kind of a target number that you should keep in mind when you're putting a series together? Is it 3 webinars? Is it 5? Does it depend on, what your topic is? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are all important factors. I think let's take a step back. To do a webinar properly, from the planning, from the time you say let's go to go live, you really need, and I'm including the audience recruitment, you really need about 8 weeks. And that's even pushing it. And so when you go through that, and it takes you 8 weeks to do it, you need to factor that into the frequency. I would say that you want to make sure that you don't fatigue your list, and that you use a frequency of maybe every 6 weeks at the shortest, and maybe every 90 days. It's really hard. These are really hard to do right, because there's a lot of planning and follow-up. So my answer is you could set 3 for your series, you could do 4, and you could easily get them done in a year. But give yourself some time, because the planning is the most critical part of any webinar, any event.
Yep, absolutely agree with you on that one. Again, kind of one of these kind of pulling it all together type of questions here. This one's from Matt, and he wants to know, you're in the process of developing each of the webinars in your series. So his question is, what's the ideal amount of time for presenting information and case studies and allowing for Q&A? And I think we're hopefully we are giving a good example of that here today as we're presenting. But any further thoughts you want to share on just kind of the timing and how to kind of lay out the logistics of a webcast?
Yes, I think today is a perfect example. Few moments to welcome the audience and do some housekeeping, and I just mean a few minutes. And when you factor in the time for polls and wanting to leave 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A, which we did today, you probably have 35 minutes of on-air time. And that 35 minutes has got to be divided with all your speakers. And so sometimes it's challenging to get everything into the session. I'm reminded one of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, who said, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." And that analogy is exactly the way of doing a webinar. It takes you really being on your game and being crisp and focused to get that information out. The last thing you want to do is run out with 1 minute left for Q&A. You'll frustrate your audience, and they're going to be overwhelmed. So less is better, but that's the approximate breakdown that I would have. 35 minutes of on-air time, 5 minutes for the housekeeping, and a few minutes for polls, and then leave that 15 or 20 minutes at the end.
Yep, and again, I think hopefully we're displaying that right now. So, good points there. Another thing that I think is really important here, and we've had a number of individuals asking in general about speaker engagement, and just I think that's a really important thing as well. Is working with your speakers and getting them to prepare as for their presentation. They're not seen by the audience, so the only way that they can really kind of interact and excite an audience is how they're delivering it. Is it in their voice and that kind of thing. So any other thoughts you can share about how to really kind of motivate those speakers to really get out there and give it everything they've got during those 35 minutes or so to really kind of engage and pull that audience in?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. And, one of the most important parts in a webinar or any event are the human factors. First thing is, find a speaker who's passionate and has something that they're excited to share. That's number one. They're proud and they want to share that, because that enthusiasm will come through, because your only connection to your audience is your voice. And if they're not excited, the audience won't be excited. So that's number one. But how do you do that? Is by doing a lot of coaching behind the scenes. And that starts with realizing that all speakers, especially the good ones, are busy people. They have a day job. Yes, the webinar is important, but you've got to optimize and maximize their time when you meet with them, so they know you know what you're doing. You give them honest coaching, and you go through what we call them table reads and dress rehearsals. After the invitation is done, and they've contributed to it, you take those deliverables and the tone of the invitation, and then you lay it out on the table, if you will, and find out which speaker is going to take which. Who's going to talk about the S codes, who's going to talk about the AAA and whatever. And then you work with them to have a conversation, not read their slides, not have a death by PowerPoint. And so you go through the table read to kind of you do the blocking and tackling. And then you have follow-up meetings that are called dress rehearsals that can go an hour and a half each. But you work with them to make sure they're comfortable, it's natural. You encourage them to have visuals so the audience is listening to them rather than reading their slides. But it's a lot of practice. You do sound checks. I'm sure there are people in the audience going, well, how do you get people to do that? You get people to do that by showing them that this is an important opportunity for them to make a contribution, but it also, and they know it, is going to help them raise their own personal brand and profile. And if you are organized and you run your meetings as such and you respect their time and you're there to help them, they'll blow it out of the park on webinar day.
Absolutely agree with you 100%. Probably got time for another couple of quick questions here.
Sure.
But a good kind of real life situation coming in here from Bailey, who says their client is a client that's never done a webinar. They've never had any experience with this. So with something like that where they've never experienced a webinar, what are your thoughts on should they start out with a one-off or, should they jump right into the series? Should the one-off kind of be put out there to kind of test the success and metrics or go right into the series itself?
Well, I think you should always test. Even with subject lines, you want to test subject lines. That's part of the purpose. Yes, you test. You should do a one-off, and you should, if you've never done a webinar before, do it on an audience that you trust that'll give you honest feedback, and find out how well it connects. One of the things about doing that before you do a series is that it takes a lot of iterations till you get the final product. We call it the WebAttract sausage factory. I mean, Anthony, if you saw some of the slide decks and the way we started with some of our clients till it was delivered, it would be, you wonder, how did it come out and be so good? Well, it comes out through practice. So rather than jumping in and do a whole series, if you've never done it before, do a small one, practice, do it on your partners or some trusted clients or some trusted colleagues, or do an internal one, get their feedback, what worked, what didn't, were you on point, then go ahead and do it, and then build off that. I mean, obviously, that's what we do, and I mean, if you're interested in having a deeper conversation, I'd love to talk to you about it. But that's what I'd recommend you do. Start small.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much for that. And as I said, I think we've got time for one more question here. And my screen just went blank here, so let me pull that back up here really quickly.
While you're waiting, I did see a question come in. Somebody wanted to know about, in the subject line, is bracketing initial words a new best practice? I don't know if it's a new best practice, but to be CAN spam compliant, you need to let your audience know that it is a solicitation. So by putting a bracket with webinar around it, kind of lets them know that that's what it is. And, we find that to be very effective. But go ahead, Anthony.
Absolutely. Yep, so this one that I had for you from Scott, and he wants to know, so visiting the case studies that you shared with us today, did they all hit the same email list every time, or did they use, like additional lists or just unique lists for each one? So how were those individually promoted? Okay,
so let me just answer the obvious. No, it was a completely different demographic for each campaign. So in other words, what we use for Novel, we didn't use for Viata. What we used for Viata, we didn't use for Bosch. So absolutely not. What we do, and I mentioned this earlier, is that we identify who is the ideal demographic that we want to attract by industry, by job title, by size of company. So we find that, and a typical back of the envelope a rule of thumb is, to get 250 people, 125 to 250 people to attend a webinar, you need to look at a database of about 50,000 names. And if you do 4 drips or 4 email blasts, give or take, over a 3-week period, you will get between 1/4 to 1/2 of 1% of those to register, which is 125 to 250. Of those, 40% should attend. So each one has to be specific, and I think there's probably, as important as the subject line is the specificity of your targeted list. And sometimes you have to make adjustments mid-course. Again, that's why metrics are so important. You don't wait to the end. With the response you get on click-through ratio and open rates, you know whether or not it's connecting, and you're constantly in the engine room, if you will, Anthony, looking for ways to modify and tweak the success of your email marketing.
Great stuff. Well, Mike, unfortunately, we have reached the end here, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But thanks again. This has been a lot of fun for me. I enjoy working with you and doing all of this good stuff with you. Great information. And to those of you that we weren't able to get to, we will do our best to do some kind of a follow-up with you. And Alna, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you to wrap up the webcast.
Thanks for joining us.